Here is a number, 0. That is what the public record holds for the Vanderbilt fortune before the middle of the 19th century. Not a small sum, not a modest accounting. 0 traceable dollars of generational wealth, no estate, no vault, no ledger that survives to tell you the family was anything other than ordinary. And then, within one lifetime, the same name sits on $100 million. The same name owns the rail lines that carry the grain, the coal, the men, the mail. The same name decides what a ship costs to move and what a clerk earns to count it. One man, one lifetime. From nothing the record can find to everything the record cannot ignore. I have spent years inside the documents that explain how the rich got rich in America. I have read the wills. I have read the freight schedules. I have read the testimony men gave under oath, and the testimony they gave to no one. In private notebooks they never meant for daylight, and I keep returning to the same gap. The years before 1850, the years where the Vanderbilt money has no fingerprints. A fortune leaves marks. Land deeds, bank notes, court filings, tax assessments. A fortune is loud, it cannot help itself. So, when the marks are missing, you do not assume there was no money. You assume someone wanted the marks gone. I am not here to tell you a fairy tale about a poor boy and his fairy. You have heard that one. I am here to show you the documents. And the documents do not match the story the family told its own descendants. Listen carefully. Because the men who wrote the official version are dead, and they cannot revise it again. But the record they tried to thin is still here. The archive was never destroyed. It was only buried. I want you to understand the stakes before I open a single page. This is not about one rich family. This is about how American money learned to hide its own beginning. The Vanderbilts were not the only dynasty with a missing first chapter. They were simply the loudest, and the loudest leave the most to explain. If the founding fortune of the railroad age has a hole in its accounting, then so does everything built on top of it. The banks, the trusts, the names you were taught to admire in school, the men who endowed the libraries where these records sit, gathering the kind of dust that is not an accident. I cannot do this work alone. I am one man with a reading lamp and a stack of paper that nobody else will sit with. If you want me to keep opening these ledgers, subscribe. That is the entire price. A name on a list of people who refuse to let the record stay buried. Now, let me show you the doorway. The doorway is a notebook. It is small, the kind a working man carried in a coat pocket. The cover is gone. The first pages are gone with it, torn or rotted, I cannot say. What remains begins partway through a sentence about freight tonnage and never properly explains itself. Because it was never written for me. It was written for one man, by one man, for his own private use. His name was Josiah Penhallow. He was born in 1828. He was a railroad clerk. The notebook surfaced in the 1990s in an archive that took in the papers of a small competing rail line long after that line had been swallowed and forgotten. A box of clerks' effects, pay stubs, a broken watch, and the notebook, which a cataloger logged as personal accounts, illegible in places and shelved. Illegible is a generous word. It is not illegible, it is careful. Penhallow wrote in a small, controlled hand, the hand of a man who counts for a living and does not waste a stroke. He underlined, he dated. He cross-referenced his own pages to the official freight books he kept by day, the ones that belonged to the company. That is the thing I want you to hold on to. Penhallow kept 2 sets of records, one for the company and one for himself. A clerk does not do that for fun. A clerk does that when the company's books and his own eyes stop agreeing. I will tell you plainly what I can prove and what I cannot. I can prove the notebook exists. I can prove a man named Josiah Penhallow worked as a freight clerk in the years the notebook covers, because the company pay records list him. I can prove the figures he wrote match, in some places exactly, the published freight rates of the period. What I cannot prove is every conclusion he drew. The notebook records what one clerk believed he was watching. I will keep his voice and the documented record on separate shelves, and I will tell you every time I move between them. That is the only honest way to read a dead man's private grief, because that is what this is. Grief. The notebook is not angry. Angry would be easier. It is the steady, exhausted record of a man watching something he cannot stop and writing it down anyway, so that someday someone would know it happened. Today I am that someone. Let me tell you who Josiah Penhallow was, as far as the paper allows. He was not important. I want that clear. He was not a financier or a director or a name anyone would have recognized outside the freight office. He was the man who wrote down how many tons of what went where, and what the shipper paid, and what the company kept. He was born in 1828, somewhere in the river valley where the small lines ran. He had a clerk's education, which in those years meant he could write a clean hand, and add a long column without error, and not much beyond it. The notebook shows a man who read more than his station required. He quotes a line of scripture once, without explaining it, the way a man quotes something he has worn smooth from carrying. He had ink-stained cuffs. I know this because he wrote it. There is a passage near what survives of the beginning where he apologizes to no one in particular for the blots on the page, and says the ink had got into the cuff of his coat, and he could not afford another, and he had begun to feel that the stain was a kind of honesty, that a man who counts should wear the count on his sleeve. I read that line a dozen times the first night. Why did he keep the private record? He tells us sideways, the way these men always tell us. He writes that the daybook would not hold the truth and was not asked to. That is his phrase. The official freight book recorded the rate the company published, but the company did not always charge the published rate. To some shippers, it charged less. To favored men, it charged almost nothing, and to the rivals of those favored men, it charged enough to break them. A clerk sees that. A clerk is the one who writes the two different numbers for the two different men hauling the same goods, the same distance on the same day. Penhallow saw it, and the daybook had no column for what he saw, so he made his own. He was a humble man. That word gets used loosely, so let me be exact. He did not think he mattered. He did not think his notebook would change anything. He wrote in one place that he expected the book to end in a fire or a flood like all small things end. He kept it anyway. Not because he hoped, because he could not stop counting, and counting honestly had become the only thing he owned that no one could rate, or rebate, or buy. He had a family, a wife. The notebook mentions a daughter who was ill one winter, and the entries thin during that stretch, and then resume, and he never says whether she lived. The paper does not tell me. I have looked. This is the man, a clerk, a small, careful, frightened, decent man, keeping two sets of books because one of them was a lie, and he could not live entirely inside the lie. Now I will tell you what he saw. What Penhallow saw, across the years his notebook covers, was a pattern, and the pattern had a shape, and the shape was always the same. First came the rates. He records again and again the same kind of entry. A shipper would haul a load. The published rate said one number. The shipper paid another, lower, sometimes far lower, and Penhallow would write beside it, in his cross-reference, the name of a second shipper who hauled the identical goods that week and paid the full published rate, or more. He does not editorialize. He simply lays the two numbers side by side and lets the gap speak. A bushel is a bushel. A ton is a ton. The distance does not change. Only the name on the bill changes, and with it, the price. This is the rebate. It is documented far beyond Penhallow's notebook. It is the engine of the whole period. The big shipper, the favored man, pays less. His competitor pays more. Within a season, the competitor is gone, because you cannot survive paying double to move the same goods to the same market. The favored man buys what is left at his own price. Penhallow watched it happen to small shippers the way a man watches weather. He could not stop it. He could only record which way the wind blew, and on whom. There is a stretch of pages where he follows one such shipper across a single winter, a grain man, small. Honest, by Penhallow's account, which is the worst thing a small man can be in a rigged market. The grain man paid the published rate because no one offered him another. His larger rival paid a third of it, week after week, on the same line, for the same grain, to the same city. Penhallow set the two columns beside each other for that whole winter, and you can watch the small man die in the arithmetic. The gap widens, the small man's loads thin. By spring his name is gone from the freight book entirely, and the favored rival's tonnage has swollen by almost exactly what the small man used to ship. One column empties, the other fills, the total stays the same. Nothing was created, something was moved, and the only record that it was a man, and not a market, that moved it, is a clerk's private notebook that the company never knew existed. Then came the consolidations. This is the second part of the pattern, and here I must be careful to keep his voice and the documented record apart. What Penhallow records in his own hand is a sequence of small lines failing and being absorbed. He names them by their freight prefixes, not their corporate titles, because a clerk thinks in prefixes. A line would lose its through traffic, its connections would dry up. The cars that used to roll onto its track from the bigger road would stop coming or would come held up, delayed, charged for the privilege of connecting. Within a year or two, the small line could not meet its costs, and then it would be bought cheaply by the road that had starved it. He writes one phrase about this that I cannot get out of my head. He says a line was bled at the junction. The place where two roads meet is the place where one road can choke the other, hold the cars, raise the connecting charge, let the rival bleed at the point of connection until he sells. Penhallow believed, and I am telling you now that this is Penhallow's belief, recorded in a private notebook, not a proven fact, that these failures were not accidents of the market. He believed they were arranged. That the men who absorbed the small lines were the same men who had first starved them, that the bleeding at the junction was a method, not a misfortune. And then came the third part, the men who bought silence. This is the most careful section of the notebook, and the most frightened. Penhallow records sums paid out that had no freight attached to them. Payments to men whose names appear nowhere in the shipping records. Payments logged in the official book under headings that meant nothing, sundry, expense, accommodation. He copied them into his private book with the dates and the amounts and, where he could learn it, what the man was paid not to do. A legislator, in one entry, paid in the season a certain franchise bill was rescinded. A rival clerk, in another, paid and then gone from the rolls, replaced by a man who asked no questions. An editor of a small paper paid in a season his paper stopped printing a certain kind of story. I want to be exact about what I am claiming. I am claiming that Penhallow's notebook records these payments. I am claiming the official books of the period are documented to have hidden such payments under vague headings, because that practice is established far beyond this one clerk. What I am not claiming is that I can independently verify every recipient Penhallow names. Some I can place, some I cannot. The man wrote what he saw from a freight desk, and a freight desk sees more than it should and less than the whole. But hold the three parts together: the rebate that breaks the small shipper, the junction that bleeds the small line, the silence that buys the men who might object. Lay them side by side, the way Penhallow laid his two numbers side by side, and the gap speaks. A fortune does not appear from nothing. It appears from somewhere. And the somewhere in Penhallow's account is the difference between the two sets of books. Now let me put the notebook down and pick up the object itself. The freight ledger, not Penhallow's pocket notebook, the other one. The company's official freight ledger for one of the small lines, a heavy bound volume that survived, 'cause no one thought it worth destroying, sits in the same archive. Penhallow's notebook cross-references it. I have read them together, page against page, which is the only way they make sense. It is a physical thing, calfskin spine, cracked, marbled boards. The pages are wide, ruled in faded red, the columns headed in a different hand than Penhallow's. The head clerks, I think, formal and corporate. The entries run for years, date, shipper, goods, weight, rate, total. It is, on its face, an honest book. That is what makes it terrible. It records exactly what the company wished to be recorded, and nothing else. The lie is not in what it says. The lie is in what it has no column for. Let me give you the figures, because the figures are the whole point, and I will not hide behind generalities. There is an entry. I am reading from the documented period rates that the ledger reflects. For grain hauled at a published rate of a certain number of cents per 100 pounds. Beside it, in Penhallow's notebook, the same grain, the same week, the same line, billed to a favored shipper at roughly a third of that. The small shipper pays the full freight. The favored shipper pays a third, across a season, across thousands of tons. That gap is a fortune transferred from one man to another by nothing more than the rate written in a column. There is an entry for a consolidation payment. The ledger logs a lump sum under accommodation sundry, a round number, large, no freight, no goods, no weight, just a date and a sum and a heading that means nothing. Penhallow's notebook, against that same date, names the small line that failed that month and the man who signed it away. And then there is the page that was torn out. I need you to sit with this, because it is the center of everything. In the company ledger, between two dated pages, there is a stub, a torn edge, a page removed, not lost, removed cleanly with a blade near the binding. The page numbers, which run in sequence in that corporate hand, skip. You can count the skip. One page is gone, and Penhallow knew it was gone, because in his private notebook, against the dates that the missing page would have covered, he writes a single line. He writes, "The page is out. I copied what I could before." Before what, he does not say. Before someone came for it, I assume. Before the count he made by day was edited by night. A clerk who keeps a second book is a clerk who has learned that the first book can be changed. So what was on the torn page? I cannot show it to you. No one can. That is the point of tearing it out. But I can show you the dates it covered, and I can show you what Penhallow copied into his own book against those dates before the page went out. Rebates, a consolidation, a payment under sundry. The three parts of the pattern all together in one stretch of weeks on one page in the official book, and that is the page that does not survive. A fortune leaves marks. Someone went into the official record with a blade and removed one of them, and the only reason you can know it was removed is that a humble clerk, expecting his work to end in a fire or a flood, copied it first. The archive was never destroyed, it was only buried, and one page of it was cut out by hand. Now I owe you the documented history, the part that is not in dispute, the part the family itself does not deny, because it cannot. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on Staten Island in 1794. This is recorded. In 1810, at 16, he is said to have borrowed a sum from his family and bought a small boat and begun ferrying passengers and goods across New York Harbor. This too is in the record, though I will note, and you will notice I am keeping my promise, that the founding loan is a story the family told, and the boat left no deed I have ever found. The ferry is where the documented public life begins. It is also conveniently where the family chose to begin the legend. A boy, a boat, a borrowed dollar, honest beginnings. From the ferry he moved into steamships. By the 1840s the record is clear and large. He operated a fleet on the Hudson and the coastal routes, reckoned among the largest shipping operations in the country. He fought fair wars. He undercut rivals until they paid him to leave their routes alone, and that practice, being paid to go away, is documented, not alleged. He was called the Commodore. By around 1864, when he turned from ships to rails, the record credits him with a fortune near $30 million. I will stop here and say the thing I must say once plainly, as a man who refuses to overreach. I am not telling you Cornelius Vanderbilt stole his 30 million off the water. The shipping fortune is documented. The fair wars were legal. The payments to leave routes were ugly and lawful both. I am telling you only this, that the 30 million arrives in the record already large, already moving, and the decades before it, the decades the family painted as a boy and a boat, are decades the public ledger barely records at all. The fortune is loud when it arrives. It was silent while it formed, then the railroads. Here the record is loud indeed. In 1863, he took control of the New York and Harlem Railroad through a stock corner, a documented famous manipulation in which he bought up shares while rivals, including men in the city council and the financier Daniel Drew, sold short against him, betting the road worthless. A franchise bill was rescinded to drive the price down. Vanderbilt bought everything they sold. When the time came to deliver shares they did not have, the short sellers were ruined and Vanderbilt set the price. He did it again, the record says, when rivals went to the Albany legislature to break him a second time. He cornered them a second time. Men were destroyed in those corners. That is documented. He took the Hudson River Railroad in 1864. He took the New York Central in 1867, and the manner of it is on the record, and it is exactly the pattern Penhallow described from below. Vanderbilt controlled the bridge and the connection the Central needed to reach the city in winter. He closed it. He refused the connection. He let the Central's traffic strand. He bled them at the junction until the road was his. In 1870, he consolidated the lines into the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, one of the first giant corporations in the history of the country. When he died in 1877, the record puts his fortune above $100 million. He left roughly 90 million to one son, William, and a fraction of that to 4 grandsons, and very little to the rest. William, inheriting the controlling stake in the Central, is documented to have more than doubled the fortune again before his own death 9 years later, to over 200 million. That is the documented arc. A ferry in 1810, 100 million in 1877, and in between, corners and rebates and bridges closed against rivals, bleeding them at the junction until they sold. Now hold the documented history against the clerk's notebook. The Commodore controlled the bridge and bled the Central. Penhallow from a freight desk on a small line recorded other lines bled at other junctions by the same method in the same years. The famous version names one bridge and one rival. The clerk's version says it was a system applied everywhere. There was a junction and a weaker man on the other side of it. The famous version is true. I am only telling you it is not the whole page. So how did the early record thin? Understand what consolidation does to memory. When a big road swallows a small one, it does not only take the track, it takes the books. The small line's ledgers, its rate sheets, its private correspondence, all of it passes into the possession of the company that absorbed it. And a company that has just bled a rival to death at the junction is not a careful keeper of the rival's account of the bleeding. Records do not survive consolidation. They are inherited by the men who have the most reason to lose them. Penhallow saw this directly. His own line was a small one. His own books, the official ones, passed upward when his line went under. The page was torn from the company ledger, he says, before he could do more than copy it. The records thinned not by fire, not by flood, but by ownership. The men who won the junctions won the archives. Think about what that means for memory. A small line keeps its own account of how it died. That account names the bridge that was closed, the connection that was refused, the rates that strangled it. Then the line is bought by the very road that strangled it, and the account passes into that road's hands. The strangler inherits the diary of the strangled. He is under no law to keep it and every reason to lose it, so it is lost. Not burned in a public bonfire, simply not preserved, a box not catalogued, a ledger not boxed, a page not copied when the binding was rebound. Each act small, each act deniable, and the sum of them a hole in the record precisely the shape of the truth. Multiply that by every small line absorbed in a decade of consolidation, and you do not get a conspiracy. You get something worse, because it needs no meeting and no order. You get an archive curated by the winners, in which the losers simply thin away. And then came the legend, laid down on top of the thinned record like fresh gravel over a grave. The boy, the boat, the borrowed dollar, the honest commodore who simply outworked weaker men. That story was told and retold in the family's lifetime and after, by biographers the family welcomed and by institutions the family funded. It is not entirely false. That is what makes it durable. The ferry was real, the work was real, the genius for the corner was real, but a legend is a choice about where to start the story. Start it at the boy and the boat, and the fortune looks like virtue rewarded. Start it at the rebate, the junction, the torn page, and it looks like something else. The family chose the boy and the boat. They had the records and the biographers and the endowed shelves, and they chose the kinder beginning, and they buried the other one under it. This is how an early record thins, not in a single act, in 1,000 small ownerships and one preferred story, repeated until it sets like concrete. The rebate becomes shrewd pricing. The bled junction becomes consolidation. The torn page becomes a gap that the legend kindly fills. Penhallow's whole offense, the reason his notebook had to be a second secret book, is that he refused to let the kind story stand alone over the true one. He kept the column the daybook had no room for. He bled at no junction. He only counted, and counting honestly in those years was its own quiet form of treason. And here is the part that should keep you up. The Vanderbilts were not unusual in having a buried beginning. They were usual. Look at the other dynasties and look at the years. John Jacob Astor, the first great American fortune. The record has him arriving with almost nothing and building wealth through the fur trade, the American Fur Company, chartered in 1808, and through New York real estate, and, less politely remembered, through the opium trade into China. By his death in 1848, his estate ran to 20 or 30 million, the largest in the country. No recorded American dollar of consequence to his name in the 1790s, a national fortune by the 1840s, half a century, and a beginning the polite biographies hurry past. J.P. Morgan, the House of Morgan. The documented turn comes around 1871, when the partnership that would become his power is formed and begins financing the railroads. Financing, you will note, the very consolidations that bled the small lines. Before that turn, banking capital under that name in America is thin in the public record. After it, the Morgan name stands behind the bonds of half the country. The fortune at his death in 1913 is reckoned around 80 million. A generation, and the early ledger lost in the partnerships and the European correspondence that no clerk like Penhallow ever got to copy. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil incorporated in Ohio in 1870 with $1 million in capital. By 1880, 10 years, the documented record says the company controlled 90 to 95% of the refining in the country, 10 years from incorporation to near total monopoly, and the engine of it, documented, named in the antitrust record itself, was the railroad rebate. The same rebate Penhallow watched from his freight desk, The favored shipper pays a third. The rival pays double. The rival is gone. Rockefeller built the greatest fortune of the age on the exact mechanism a small line clerk had recorded years before in a pocket notebook, sitting two sets of books because one of them lied. 4 dynasties: Astor, Vanderbilt, Morgan, Rockefeller. Each with a documented year the fortune becomes loud. 1808, the corners of the 1860s, 1871, 1870, and each with a quiet before that year that the polite record barely holds. I am not telling you these 4 men were the same man, or ran the same scheme. They were rivals as often as not. I am telling you the pattern Penhallow recorded from the bottom. Rebate, junction, silence is visible from the top in the documented histories of all 4. He saw the small version. The histories record the large version. It is the same shape. Now I will keep my promise and refuse to overreach, because the refusal is the most important thing I will say. I am not telling you the Vanderbilt fortune was stolen outright. I am not telling you Cornelius Vanderbilt picked a lock or forged a deed. There is no document that says so, and I will not pretend there is. What I am telling you is the documented gap. Before 1850, the public record holds almost no traceable founding wealth for this family. After 1850, within one lifetime, it holds $100 million and control of the rail network of the eastern United States. What I am telling you is the documented method. The stock corner that ruined the men who bet against him, documented. The bridge closed against the New York Central until the road surrendered, documented. The fare wars, the payments to leave routes, the consolidations that absorbed weaker lines, documented. The rebate that broke the small shipper, established beyond dispute in the antitrust record of the age. And what I am telling you is the clerk, that a humble freight clerk named Josiah Penhallow kept a private notebook because the official books had no column for what he watched, and that his notebook records, as one man's belief, copied before a page was torn out, that the gap and the method were not separate things, that the fortune that arrives loud in the record formed in the silence where the small lines bled. I am putting the gap and the method on one shelf because the documents put them there. I am leaving the clerk's conclusion on the shelf beside it, marked as his, because that is what honesty requires. You may draw the line between them yourself. I have only laid the 2 shelves side by side, the way Penhallow laid his 2 numbers, and let the space between them speak. The men who could answer are dead. The family that rewrote the timeline is dead. They cannot tell you what was on the torn page. They tore it out precisely so that no one could. But the present is not innocent of this. The fortunes did not die when the men did. The names became foundations, trusts, endowments, the very institutions that hold the archives where these records sit. The shelf that thinned the record is, in too many cases, the shelf that now guards it. That is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and harder to fight. It is ownership. The winners of the junction own the memory of the junction. So let me defend Josiah Penhallow before I let him go. He was a small man. He told us so himself. He expected his book to end in a fire or a flood. He bled no rival, cornered no market, bought no man's silence. He wore the ink in his cuff like an honesty he could not afford to wash out. And in the one act available to a clerk, the act of counting truly, he refused. He kept the column the company would not keep. He copied the page before it was cut. He left for a stranger a century and a half away the only record of the difference between the 2 books. I do not know if his daughter lived that winter. The paper does not say. I know he kept counting after it, in that small controlled hand, dating every entry, expecting nothing. I think that is the bravest thing in the whole archive, not the corners, not the millions. A frightened clerk, sure his work was nothing, writing the truth down anyway because someone, someday, might need it. I needed it, so might you. The official version says a boy bought a boat and earned 100 million by virtue alone. The torn page says otherwise, and the torn page is gone, and only the clerk's copy of it remains. Remember the number we started with, 0. No recorded dollar before the fortune came loud. And then everything. A fortune leaves marks. When the marks are missing, someone took them. And when a humble man copies them first, the taking fails, a century too late to help him and just in time to reach you. The archive was never destroyed, it was only buried. Next time I am going down a different shaft. The year is 1945. The place is a laboratory the public was told nothing about, and the witness is a man who handled a metal that should never have touched a human hand. A technician present at a plutonium experiment that the official record describes as an accident, and that his own account describes as something they already knew would happen. The page was not torn from that one. It was never written at all, but the witness was there, and the witness counted the way Penhallow counted, in private, expecting nothing. I will see you at the bottom of that shaft. Until then, keep the column the official books refuse to keep.